So I'm basically focusing, the focus of my talk is really oriented to producers and decision makers, and I guess, the people that work with them. First of all, the story. In the Korean War, there was air battles were a large part of the Korean War. And on the left, you can see it's the MiG-15 that was a Soviet-produced plane. It had superior power. There was more of them. They had a location advantage in terms of where they were situated, and this plane was much, much superior at higher altitudes. The American-made plane was relatively new. It hadn't really undergone a lot of experience in those fighting situations, and the Americans and flying under the United Nations, they were uncertain of how it would perform. Their best estimate at the time is that they would suffer, that Sabre plane would suffer a loss of 10 for every one of the MiGs that they were able to shoot down. As it turned out, here's the final numbers. The Sabre, actually, there was a 10-to-1 ratio, and actually the Sabre was able to shoot down 10 of the MiGs for every one of the Sabres that was shot down. So when they started looking at this, the first level of analysis was, well, our pilots must be better. And that's why we got these kind of results. Later on, there was an individual, his name was Boyd, and he dug into some of the numbers and started doing a little bit deeper of analysis, and he came up with this information. Basically, there was a difference in the planes. The MiG had limited visibility, and one of the analysis was, like it says there, it was like looking through the bottom of a Coke bottle. And also, it only had partial hydraulics, and it required greater upper body strength to maneuver the plane. And in fact, the pilots of that plane, when they weren't flying, they were doing upper body strength exercises so that they could maneuver the plane. Meanwhile, the Sabre, and maybe you can see it in the photos there, had 360-degree visibility. It had that bubble that was, so the pilot could see all around him, and it had full hydraulic controls. So in addition to be able to see everything as it was shaping up, the pilot was able to quickly make adjustments. And so from there, there's something that, I'm going to build on here. There's something that we can learn from this. And first of all, timing is more important than raw speed. Secondly, it's the ability to take the right action at the right time. So we've always heard about this. Timing is important, and to be able to take the right action at the right time and be able to recognize and capture opportunities as well as mitigate threats. And so the theme that I'm going to come up with here is it's this process of identify, assess, and act. And that's really what that plane enabled the pilots to do and enabled them to be successful. So from that story, we have to deal with this. Everybody in the room, we have to deal with the future. And of course, we're not very good at predicting the future. And of course, if anybody feels that they can predict the future, I will gladly like to speak to you. We know that the future is uncertain, and I guess the challenge that you as decision makers have to deal with is preparing for whatever the future might throw at you. We don't know what's going to happen. How are you going to deal with it? And the reason is shift happens. Stuff changes. Things that you don't know about today are going to come at you in the future. And so the challenge is, how are you going to deal with this? We're dealing with very complex situations. There's a lot of complexity in our farming systems, things that didn't have to deal with before. There's new things emerging all the time. Decision-making is going to be a key requirement of managers in the future. And the challenge, of course, is that, and as it says there, most of what we need to know to make good decisions today is outside our comprehension. We don't even know it's there. So the challenge, as I'm saying, is making decisions under uncertainty. And I hope you can see the graphic there. The great big portion of the circle is what we don't know. What we don't know that we don't know. And the much smaller portion is what we know, and of course there's a bit of a gap what we think we know there. We're moving into this area of risk, and it's important when we're talking about risk that we're dealing with we have the right type of language. This is Dr. David Hilson. He's called the risk doctor. There's his website. It's a very informative place. Risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs in the future, can have either a negative or a positive effect on your objectives. So there's key things in there. It's an uncertain event. If it happens, the impact or the effect could be either negative or positive. We don't know. That's the uncertainty. And the effect is going to be on your objectives. Once again, risk management. It's about identifying, measuring, and managing risk. Another way to look at risk is you make a plan. There's a place you want to be at some point in the future. That's your objective. But we don't know, and pardon me, it's not that you don't know, but you could have any number of results. Just because you set a particular target that you wanted to get to doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be there. You could be anywhere at some point in the future, like those blue lines are suggesting. And that's that uncertainty, that's risk. And if it happens to be negative, if you undershoot your target, that's a threat. And if you overshoot or happen to achieve better than that target, of course, that's an opportunity. At the same time, there's management tools. And if it's a threat, some of these tools that we'll talk about here, you can avoid the risk, you can transfer the risk to somebody else, like in insurance, you can reduce it, or of course you can accept it. Same thing if that risk or that uncertainty happens to be an opportunity. You can exploit it, you can share it, you can enhance it. Those are the strategies. So once again, the process is identify that risk, assess it, and then develop a management strategy for dealing with it. Now, at this point, I want to make clear, a lot of people think, well, if there's no risk, there's no reward. That's right. And if you eliminate risk, of course, there's not going to be any reward. And that's not what I'm about. I'm saying taking on risk and managing it. And so this is the gem. This is probably the best part of the whole presentation here. This is the opportunity. So if you're able to recognize risk, and you can control those blue lines that we put up there, you'll be less likely to get knocked out of the game. So if you can identify and recognize the extremes of the outcomes that you might be facing when you take on a new action, if you can manage those extremes, you should be able to survive, stay in the game. Okay, don't take the hit and be able to stay in the game. And as well, if you're good at managing risks, you should be able to successfully invest or take on projects, more projects that have a higher level of risk, but they have more profitability. So being a stronger risk manager could be the path to being a competitive advantage. If you're a better risk manager, you can take on higher risk projects, manage the risk, gain the benefits that go along with higher risk. That's what risk management is about. And here's the process, or here's some of the key requirements. You have to take ownership of risk. If you don't have ownership, if you're not responsible for risk, nothing's going to get done. As I've said before, or haven't said this yet, set the context. What are the objectives that risk can impact on? Identify the risks, assess the risks, develop strategies for dealing with them, and then reassess those risks with the strategies in place. Taking ownership of risk is particularly important if you're dealing with a bigger family, a bigger farm family, or a bigger organization. You got multiple people in there. Who's responsible? Who's the owner of that particular risk that has to be managed? And that's the key step. Somebody has to have ownership of that risk. When that ownership is there, then they'll be responsible for managing it. Context it's important to establish context, because risk is directly linked to objectives. Your objectives can be, every farm is unique. We all have different objectives. It could be growth to gain some economies of scale, some form of profitability, some production performance, market performance, or some balance of profitability with all these other objectives. Risk can affect, certain types of risk can affect those objectives. That's what we're trying to manage. Another way of looking at risk is the way your farm, all the things that you have, all these assets you have in your farm. And if you think of these assets not just in terms of the physical assets, but the customer assets, the relationships that you have with the marketplace. If you think of in terms of the employer relationships that you have, some of these farms are doing really well with top-notch employees, and that's an asset that helps produce value. Similarly, there's financial assets. And then there's the manager, the organizational assets, and the leadership, the things that are mentioned there, strategy, decision-making processes, innovation. Those are all assets. Those are the things that farm business utilizes and puts together to create value. Risk, uncertainty can affect those resources and their ability to create value. Identifying risk, as I've been saying, is the first step. So what does risk look like? One of the things to keep in mind, and I guess we could even go back to what you heard before lunch there in terms of the market summary. We need to separate the cause, the risk, and the effect. So that a cause is something that's there. So the markets are uncertain. That's a fact. That's not necessarily risk. The risk could be that the markets move against you for an extended period of time. That's the uncertainty. And then, of course, the effect is, how is that going to impact on your objectives? Is that going to affect the profitability that you need or the cash flow that you need or whatever it happens to be? So identifying risk, you need to separate the things that are fact from the things that are uncertain and then the effect that they might have on your objectives. There's some techniques for identifying risk. The basic one is some probing questions. What keeps you up at night? Are there things that are concerning you? What's the source of that risk? What's the source of that disturbance? You can always ask yourself, how could this go wrong? You know, that's what I say to one of my sons. Like, what could go wrong with this? What could go right? We're not always just looking for threats. We want to be looking for opportunities as well. There's this thing called a pre-mortem, and this comes out of that book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slowly. Basically, a pre-mortem is you made a decision and you're implementing a plan. So you're thinking about implementing a plan. Now fast track into the future. And so let's say that decision, that implementation, it became a wreck. Now take some time and step back and write down, okay, what are all the things that led up to that wreck? What you're doing is you're putting yourself in the future. So a post-mortem, of course, is you're looking at a problem after it's happened. A pre-mortem is you're saying a problem or a good thing. What happened? What are all the things that led to that? So pre-mortem is another thinking approach that you can use to identify risks. There's always this thing about assumptions and constraints. So you can pick up this, you can use this saying, sometimes the risk is in the assumptions. We make certain assumptions about how things are going to work out when you make a decision or implement a plan of action. Often the risk is in those assumptions. How good are those assumptions? Similarly, there's often the opportunity is in the constraints. Sometimes in a farm business you may feel that you're not able to do something because of certain constraints. The opportunity is in those constraints sometimes. I guess, as way of an example, I'm kind of thinking that one of the constraints that some of the farms are dealing with, the larger farms that have a limited land ownership but a large extent of rented land, access to capital might be becoming a constraint. What's the opportunity to break through that constraint in terms of getting the access to capital to continue getting the economies of scale? Another approach to identifying risk is building on the SWOT analysis, and I'm sure you've heard about it, but a SWOT analysis is looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So building on the strengths in your farm business. Every farm business does something really well. They do it better than everybody else. What are those strengths? And maybe that gives you an opportunity. At the same time, you have to realize, what are our limitations? Maybe those limitations are exposing us to a threat. So you can build on that SWOT analysis kind of thinking. This is one that I particularly like. It has a German name that I can't pronounce it. And I have to mention that my friend and colleague Ted Darling we've worked together on this for quite a while, and I want to make sure that he's recognized as being a key contributor in this. He came up with this, and basically it's called the 3x3 group exercise. So there's a lot of, when you're identifying risk and you have a management team and you have 3 or 4 or 5 people, you can go through an exercise, give everybody a sheet of paper and say, all right, you've set the context, here's the objective that we're concerned about, we're trying to identify the threats or the opportunities that might affect that particular objective. You start with a sheet of paper, you write down 3 threats or opportunities. You pass the paper to the person to the right, and you get the paper from the person to the left of you. You can see what they've written down. Now you've got to write 3 more down. You can't repeat what you've already said. You can't repeat what the other person has said. But something that other person said that you can see on the paper here maybe triggers you to think of something that you hadn't thought of before. So the idea of those things is to create a dynamic of getting people to interact and create a bit of a brainstorming technique for coming up with what are the things that could go really well here, to create opportunities. What are the things that could go really bad here to create a threat that we have to be concerned about? At the same time, we've got to be concerned, or not necessarily concerned, but we have to recognize that these farm systems are part of a bigger, more complex, integrated thing. And in particular, there's these feedback loops. And you've often heard the expression unintended consequences. So it's important to be able to look at the whole farm system sometimes in terms of emerging risks. Assessing risk, there's lots of quantitative measures. Certainly there's financial measures, there's statistical measures, and there's also qualitative measures. And I guess I have to tell you is that there's a lot of fairly mathematically sophisticated people that work on the quantitative side. I tend to work on the qualitative side. And the quantitative people, they're a little elitist. They kind of look down on us qualitative people because we use words instead of numbers, and maybe words aren't as precise as numbers are. But there are quantitative approaches, and certainly all the quants behind the crop insurance, they're using statistical data, and they're coming up with probabilities. So I have to use words to describe, to assess risk. And really, but what it gets down to when we're assessing risk, it's about probability and impact. When you're thinking of risk, it has 2 dimensions. What's the likelihood or the probability that it'll occur, and what's the impact if it does occur? Probability, it's the likelihood that a risk event will occur. I'm just repeating myself here. The impact is what is the extent of those consequences? How bad is it going to hurt you? Or how good is it going to help you? Because we've got to keep positive things in balance here. This is the risk matrix, and this is a way of ranking or scoring those threats and opportunities. And so you can see that it's adapted from work by David Hilson. It has 2 dimensions. It has 2 sides. It has threats and opportunities, and on each one of those sides, there's the probability and there's of occurrence, and then there's the negative impact and the positive impact. And so when you've identified risks in terms of threats and opportunities, you can score them as a threat or an opportunity, probability, and impact. And basically the idea is the stuff, if you score something and it ends up in that red zone, that's the tree of action, it's called, or they call it the arrow of action. Those are the ones that have to be taken care of right away. Those are the ones that can hurt you, that you really need to deal with. And the further out, in the yellow and the green, those are the less important or not as urgent to deal with types of risks. To help you make that scoring, this is all part of the risk matrix, risk choices material that Alberta Agriculture has on their website. This is the terminology that you can use to distinguish between the different levels of probability. And just for an example, a very high probability is almost certain to occur, and a high probability is likely to occur. Similarly, we have descriptors of the impact of a particular risk. Significant consequences right down to negligible consequences. So I would think something like BSE had a fairly low likelihood of occurring, but a very high impact when it did occur. This I'm not sure how visible this is or how well you can see it, but this is the result of a workshop with a group of berry producers in the lower mainland of BC. We went through the exercise. We went through that 3x3 sheet thing. We filled up whiteboards with all the risks, the threats, and the opportunities that I identified, and then they worked as a group on the whiteboards in terms of ranking them and scoring them. And over a period of time, we were able to. We had fairly close to about. We gave them a case farm on a blueberry farm, and we were able to basically. We started with about 75 identified risks, and we were able to narrow down the action to about the top 7. And they did the scoring themselves. So we've identified, now we've assessed, now we've got to go back to the toolbox for dealing with these risks. Like I mentioned earlier, if it's a threat, you can avoid it. You can walk away from it. You can do something else. Or you can reduce that risk. You can reduce by diversifying. You can, and I guess the thing to remember here, the important thing to remember is when you're managing risk, there's a cost. You're going to be giving up something. You're going to pay an insurance agent, or the diversification may mean that you're not quite running at the optimal point that you want to be. You can reduce the size of the project to reduce your exposure to risk. You can transfer that risk, like in insurance, or contracts, or find a partner. Or you can just accept it. You can just, you just stand up there and take it on the chin. If it goes that way, so be it. Similarly, on the opportunity side, you can exploit it. You can go after the activity aggressively. You can enhance it. You can do similar projects. You can increase the scale. You can leverage more. Whoops. You can share it. You can bring somebody else in so that you have the resources to capture the opportunity. And you can just stand back and not do anything and accept it. The idea here, using the matrix again, of course, is that your strategies, you want to be able to move the threats with the strategies in place. You would go back and reassess it, and you want to be able to move those threats out of that red zone into an area where the combination of impact and likelihood is more acceptable. Similarly, on the opportunity side, you want to be able to enhance some opportunities and move them into the area of the low-hanging fruit, where they're the types of opportunities that you can capture fairly quickly. So, we're winding down here. The key message is here that all risks can be managed. This whole process of identify, assess, and manage, risk is where you find it. It's attached to objectives. You've got certain objectives. You might want to be asking yourself, what are the threats and opportunities that are attached to us achieving that objective? Risk has 2 dimensions that we just talked about, probability and impact. Risk can be positive or negative. Remember, it's an uncertain event that, if it should occur, could have either a positive or a negative impact on your objectives. And I'll remind you once again that the opportunity for decision makers could be to, if you can become better, if you can become a stronger risk manager, if you can outperform your competitors as a risk manager, you could take on higher risk projects and get the rewards that go along with higher risk, simply because you're able to manage the risk that goes along with them. However, to manage risk, sometimes you have to step back from the day-to-day busyness. My theory is that farmers, well, businessmen in general, business people in general, pardon me, and farmers in particular, there's one very scarce resource. And it isn't time. Really what it is attention. There's only so much attention that businessmen and decision makers can invest in something. And I'm suggesting here, to manage risk, if you want to achieve those higher returns that go along with managing risk better, is you have to give it some attention. And to give it attention, sometimes you have to step back from the clutter that goes on, or the day-to-day hubbub of activities. You also need to overcome a limited perspective of risk. Sometimes we can get into a fairly narrow thinking that risk is, well, that's crop insurance. I got that covered off by crop insurance, and I guess there's some financial risk, but I've got equity, and that's all the risk that you see. Risk, because of the complexity that we're dealing with, because shift happens, there's new emerging risks. There's things happening all the time that could leave us sitting there saying, gee, we didn't see that coming. Sure can, and be quite surprised about it. So a failure to see the full scope and interdependency of risk in today's complex and distributed business environment, those are a lot of words, but I think you got the sense here that society is changing, the interactions between the farm businesses and the environment and society is changing, and there's new risks creeping in, emerging from these combinations or the interaction of these things. Beware the pitfalls of linear thinking. We can't just say that things are going to carry on like they have been, that we're on the same path as before. Remember, shift happens, and if you fall into this trap of linear thinking, of course, then you might not recognize the outer parameters in terms of outcomes of any type of action that you might take. And if you can't recognize those outer extremes of worst case and best case, you're not prepared to manage them, then you might be more vulnerable in terms of being able to respond to those, capture the opportunity or deal with the risk if it does happen to come along. I think if you want to try to remember something or have something to sort of remind yourself, or some words, a mantra, try this: acceptable benefits at acceptable risk. Okay? When you're taking some risk, that's what you do. Are the benefits appropriate? Are you getting the right mix, the right feel of acceptable benefits at acceptable risk? And I guess that's it for me. I can try some questions. This is where I get into trouble up here if I take questions from so I'll take the risk. But I'll be around for a while as well if you want to talk.